Video games can be great for a lot of reasons, but I think one element that can hit surprisingly hard are the boss fights. Sure, they aren't always around to help form your opinion on a game like with the controls or the presentation, but bosses are the masters of showing up whenever they feel like it, just to make an experience that much better. Unfortunately, not all battles are created equal, and when mishandled, they have the potential to really sour whatever you were enjoying prior to this. It could be something simple, like it being too easy or too hard, but to be honest, I'm often more bothered by battles that are boring, annoying, or just a waste of potential either from a gameplay or story perspective. And enough of them have been buzzing around my head recently to the point where I feel like ripping into them. So yeah, I'm talking about some of my least favorite bosses in gaming, and just in case you haven't seen one of the other, 100 or so videos on this topic, I'm gonna run through the rules real quick. One boss per franchise, I'm allowing both standard and final bosses, and unlike other lists, I'm not only gonna limit this to games I've played, but bosses also have to be from games I really like. I do think there's genuine merit in including bosses that can ruin a game for some people, or bosses that epitomize everything wrong with a game, but to be honest, that dartboard full of pictures has got so many holes in it at this point that I don't really see a reason to touch on some of these more infamous fights. This way I'm making more room for oddball picks and personal grievances, which is really what YouTube's all about, right? Shame we can't get a boss fight against them. So let's start this list off nice and easy, and by that I mean let's begin with what's probably the most difficult fight in this list. Cuphead takes a lot of pride in being what is essentially an elongated boss gauntlet, and to be honest, that pride is well deserved because the bosses in this game are largely wonderful. Obviously their designs and the ways they're animated go a long way here, but the underlying gameplay is just as strong as the surface level appearances. Most of them are pretty challenging and intricate, but it always feels like your fault when you do take a hit. That said, it only takes a couple stray factors to knock this fine line off balance, and where most of the Devil's Deaders were willing to play fair, Dr. Call's robot is a little less so. Disliked bosses with multiple phases tend to just have the one awful portion to ruin the whole package, but here, both the beginning and end of this fight are pretty infamous for very different reasons. Most bosses in Cuphead tend to throw out one attack at a time, but Iron Giant's deadbeat dad isn't spoiled for choice, since he gets to throw out 3 at a time during his first phase, and if you aren't proactive with disabling the laser walls or busting enough of these little drones, you can get overwhelmed very quickly. You gotta knock off each of his little gadgets to progress, which you'd think would give you some breathing room, but no, he just swaps it out for a new tool that you can't get rid of and is often just as annoying. After dishing out enough damage to the Tin Titan's heart, he does enter a thankfully much easier second phase where the robot head flies back and forth that doesn't take much to bring down, but it only means we get to its miserable final phase even faster. Now, Cuphead doesn't engage in true bullet hell often, but this is easily the best example in the game and probably the hardest attack to deal with across Inkwell Isle. These bootleg Chaos Emeralds spit out so many little energy bullets that are a pain to dodge even in the mini plane form, and each wave lasts an agonizingly long time, with you only getting about 2 seconds break before he does it again. It gets even more frustrating when the bullets start to blend into the background, which is just a dirty trick the rest of the game doesn't really fall to. This is probably the boss that you'll be stuck on the longest during your first playthrough of Cuphead, and when you're upstaging King Dice's Casino Royale and the devil himself, that might be the sign that you went too far in a few places. Despite all that, this isn't any higher just because this boss really isn't too bad for me on repeat playthroughs. Hell, I've A-ranked this boss and even beat on expert mode, and even found it to be pretty fun. But man, that first playthrough is not fun for you. What is the definition of a boss battle? That seems like a stupid question to ask, and it's safe to say both you and I know what they are, but let's just list off the basics to get a foundation established. First things that come to mind, a fight that has greater significance than your normal encounters with low-level garden variety mooks. They'll often be against an opponent that plays some sort of role in the story, whether they be the big bad, an underling of theirs, or maybe just some big dumb monster blocking the way to your next destination. And they do indeed require you to have your hands on the controller to press buttons to fend off a foe to avoid dying. I think we can all agree on that criteria at least. So with that in mind, is Resident Evil 4's knife fight with Krauser a boss battle? I mean, probably. Kinda wish it wasn't though. Then again, I just wish this wasn't the game, period. Resident Evil 4's faults are few and far between, but one of those faults just had to be all these damn QuickTime events. I don't mind the action commands for breaking out of enemy grabs and stuff like that, but I have just never cared for the art of sudden death by cutscene. It feels like a cheap way to kill the player every time, and these things are alarmingly common in RE4. By the time you get to Chapter 5, you're ready for them to be gone, but rest assured, the worst is yet to come. This whole fight is really just a cutscene where Jack and Leon will talk, talk, he'll try to kill you, you press buttons to knife away his knife, rinse and repeat until it's over. It only takes like 2 minutes and isn't even that hard on future playthroughs, but I just find this really dumb and unfulfilling. Resident Evil, especially the older games, are kinda infamous for most of its boss fights just being big meaty bullet sponges, and I can understand wanting to do something different from that, but was a QTE cutscene really the best they could do? The first time you play this game, you're just gonna die at multiple points because you don't know at what points Krauser will attack, and one failed button press is all it takes to instantly lose. But once you've played through and know when to expect each prompt, he just becomes a formality. And at that point, this fight is solely banking on the excitement you get from watching two manly men swinging knives at each other like it's a dollar store John Wick knockoff. But between the excessive slow motion and the overly dramatic cinematography, I suspect this game thinks this is way cooler than it actually is. But hey, at the time I'm writing this, the remake is about to come out, so maybe Capcom made this QTE fight better. Or, you know, place it with a real fight, God forbid. Character battles in Sonic games are a joke, right? Can I get away with saying that? Sure, it's been a pretty big staple of the series ever since Sonic 3, maybe even Sonic CD depending on how you see Metal Sonic, but until Sonic Generations, it felt like no game that attempted these got it completely right. Or even half right. In some games they were stupidly easy, in others they were teeth-grindingly frustrating, and one even made them both at the same time. This means that I'm not at all wanting for a target. I was really tempted to lump all the character battles from Sonic Adventure here for being so unbelievably easy that I could beat all these guys with my eyes closed, but it's fair to say that most of the other Adventure 1 bosses aren't much better in that regard. What we need is a Sonic game that actually has a solid share of good bosses, and maybe even a good character battle to prove they had figured out how to make these work. And that's where Adventure 2 comes in with the second Tails vs. Eggman fight. So, credit where credit is due, you'd expect this to be another brainless button masher in line with the previous mech battle and most of Gamma's bosses from the first game, but no, it's actually a challenge. As in, this is such a drastic 180 from the previous fight that I'm surprised that no one broke their neck making this. It's a simple objective, just blast your rival with projectiles and deplete their health bar before they can do the same to you, but your opponent does everything in their power to make this as frustrating as possible. Not only will they move fast enough to dodge most of your lock-on shots, but they come packing attacks exclusive to the multiplayer battle mode that will ruin your day. I could maybe look past the Tenta missiles on steroids, but then there's... I'm a fire in my laser!
Oh, because that's totally fair!
Sure, the final fights between the other rival pairs also give the enemy this unfair advantage, but at least the runners and hunters were agile enough to dodge these attacks consistently, and at least you could scramble for a ring to ensure your survival. There are no rings here, and with or without them, your health bar will be cut down alarmingly fast if you can't get out of the way of this apocalyptic laser. And the location isn't doing much to help either. This room is super tiny for a battle between two giant mechs. Whoever designed this boss arena was probably the same genius who thought the Capra demon from Dark Souls would be best fought in a walk-in closet, but hey, at least in that fight there wasn't a huge bomb in the middle of the arena that constantly pressures you to stay at the perimeter out of fear since your lock-on shots won't discriminate, and like everything else, it takes a massive chunk of your health away if you happen to get caught out. And this fight isn't long. This is probably one of the shortest battles on this list, but it'll feel like an ordeal if you happen to catch the AI on a bad day, where it'll proceed to kill you over and over. I get why your enemy is showing no mercy within the story. This is just after Eggman sends Sonic to his death in an exploding capsule, so this is either Tails giving it everything he has to save the day and avenge his best friend, or Eggman stomping out the last of his opposition to achieve world domination. So I get all the shooting and missiles and even the giant fucking lasers to some extent, but it just isn't fun to fight. Might want to go back to the drawing board, guys. Super Mario Sunshine is a weird game. And I love it. It's definitely not the greatest game under Mario's belt, but I do appreciate a lot of what it does to break away from traditions, with things like the location, the voice acting, and the water pump jetpack thing. That also applies to its boss fights. There's lots of strange concepts and even stranger designs, but they do really work in the game's favor. But even Mr. Video Game himself isn't free from a dud fight once in a while. I know a lot of people hate the final boss fight against Bowser because of how easy it is as he loafs around in his floating hot tub of Nickelodeon slime, but I actually kinda like that one. Sure, it lacks all the grandeur of other Bowser battles, but that's kind of the point. You literally barge in and disturb Bowser while he's on vacation, so of course he's not prepared for a fight. So yeah, I enjoy the final boss. Can't say the same about the first one though. Or the second, third, fourth, or fifth. Mario bosses can have problems with repetition. Games can easily fall into using the same bosses over and over to the point where they start to feel like a formality. The Koopalings, Boom Boom, even Bowser himself can fall into this pitfall. But this isn't another new Super Mario Bros. Game. This is Super Mario Sunshine. You've got astral manta rays, mecha kaijus on roller coasters, and underwater dentistry on leviathan eels, and this is how you open the game? With 5 different goopy, poopy piles where pretty much nothing happens? It opens its mouth, you shoot it with water, it takes damage. Do it 3 times and it dies. For a first boss meant to get you accustomed to FLUDD and its controls, sure, it's fine. But they copy-paste the polluted piranha plants for further encounters all crammed at the very start of the game, to the point that you can easily fight them off in the first hour of playtime, and that just sounds so horrible. Would you honestly want to fight any boss 5 separate times with little to no difference all at the very beginning of the game? That just sounds like the complete absence of creativity to me. But who knows, this could secretly be genius. Maybe this was intentional and they wanted to create the perfect antithetical opening so it would make the rest of the game look even better by comparison. Or maybe I need to go splash some water on my face. Hey, hi. So I was thinking of some clever setup to introduce my number 6 choice, the bloat from Binding of Isaac Rebirth, and I ended up watching YouTube videos of people fighting it, and the comments were so good and did such an amazing job describing him that I'm just gonna show off the best ones I could find. Enjoy.
Die bloat, die bloat, die bloat, die bloat, die bloat.
Skill issue. Shouldn't have booted up the game.
Still easier than the bloat.
Can we all agree that the bloat is the most, and I mean the most, annoying boss in Boy?
The bloat, more like the goat.
I hate you.
How to beat bloat without taking damage. Step 1. You don't.
Thank you. This steered was very helpful, but how do I kill Putra?
But what does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
I've never faced bloat. How hard is he?
No, so much no!
I hate this fucking piece of shit boss with every fiber of my being. The hitboxes and cast times on the brimstone lasers are so fucked. Literally a millisecond of reaction time is allowed. Plus the hitbox is turbo wonky when he casts his sideways. It literally hits you but doesn't hit you. Like Jesus Christ. What?
He's out of line, but he's right.
Fighting game bosses are tailor-made for lists like these. Maybe it's just a long-standing tradition from the days where kids threw their allowance at games so they could eke out a victory, but to me it just comes off as cheap. Instead of designing a proper fair fight, it often feels like these fighters just get some overpowered attacks, busted stats, and brutal AI that forces one to think 10 steps ahead. I'm still kinda new to these since for the longest time, all I played was Super Smash Bros., which has an entirely different design philosophy for its boss battles. But in the last couple years, I've tried my hand with more traditional fighting games. And it didn't take long to find one with a textbook bullshit fight. And it's a shame because I really enjoyed Mortal Kombat 11 for the most part. It definitely comes off as style over substance, but just playing the game, racking up damage with my favorite combatants and performing insane combos and fatalities, I was having a pretty good time. But whether you're playing the story mode or the towers, it doesn't take long to find this Tilda Swinton wannabe and her dominion over time and all its machinations. Good luck. Oh, Chronica. Chronica. Where to start with this one? Okay, so if I have to give her the slightest bit of praise, I'm at least happy she's not one of those final bosses that can wipe out your entire health bar with only a couple clean hits. But don't you worry, because what Chronica lacks in raw power, she more than makes up for with an obnoxious amount of staying power. Her health isn't any higher than the other characters, but she's got so many immunities that make about half of your moves effectively useless. She can't be grabbed, can't be juggled, barely flinches, and any hopes you had to get even with your fatal blow are not going to be treated well. On top of just taking a really long time to beat, Chronica has an incredibly toxic toolkit that makes her a nightmare to fight. She'll spam teleports every few seconds, throws around projectiles like it's going out of style, can freeze you in time for a couple seconds, allowing her to reposition or just keep hitting you, can summon a fucking T-Rex from off-screen to bowl you over, and much more. And just in case you thought she wasn't hard enough to kill already, she can create a huge energy spear around herself that will gradually restore her health, gradually drain your health, and takes up like half the frickin' stage. I can't imagine that move would be tournament legal. However, my favorite, or I guess least favorite move of hers, is Substitute. Yeah, even if you're successfully racking up the damage on her, Chronica will just up and ditch you with a newly created fighter. Granted, said fighter has an incredibly small health bar, but their damage remains intact, meaning these seemingly small distractions can sometimes be a serious threat if they happen to catch you off guard. And she gets to do this once per round in story mode, and twice per round in the towers mode, which is just so fun. I wouldn't be surprised if the beta version of this fight had Chronica restore her health based on how long you spent fighting these decoys, but I'm sure at that point the playtesters looked at NetherRealm Studios and went, "Will you cut it out?" I said earlier that Call's Robot is probably the hardest on this list, and I still stand by that, but Chronica is without question the most unfair boss on this list. Everything you learn in the game up to this point will do very little good against her, and it's because she just blatantly cheats and does whatever the hell she needs to win. She makes Shao Kahn look like an upstanding gentleman by comparison. The only reason she isn't in the top 2 or 3 is because I had no real expectations for this. It's a traditional 2D fighting game final boss. Of course it wasn't going to be fun. But Chronica really did surprise me of how bullshit she was. Let's just hope NRS scales things back for the next game, because if they decide to move up from here, we'll probably be fighting God in the next game. Good luck comboing that guy. I can't overstate how much I love fighting Disney characters in Kingdom Hearts. There isn't any deep reasoning for that. I just find it really cool that these games allow you to face off with some of the most iconic and not so iconic characters from Disney's animated canon. Plenty of which come from movies, which I have a lot of nostalgia for and still enjoy nowadays. In particular, I think the first game was the best when it came to the Disney villain lineup. Not only was the selection consisting of some of Disney's most popular baddies, but they were all heavy hitters within their own movies. You know, each was no stranger to combat, and most had pretty fantastical abilities that would lend themselves well to a boss encounter. Bosses like Ursula, Maleficent, and Chernabog are genuinely great and highlights for me both in the first game and even the whole series, but I don't think I'd appreciate them quite as much if there wasn't a way worse fight to compare them to. That's about the nicest thing I can say about Genie Jafar. If we're talking about how disappointing a boss is and how much it wastes its concept, this is probably my top pick. I get that designing a fun, fair fight with an all-powerful evil genie is probably not an easy task, and I didn't want to be beaten into oblivion with all his phenomenal cosmic powers! But I was expecting something more than Jafar just lethargically throwing boulders at Soren Company. Dude, just 5 minutes ago you were flying around, firing lasers, and summoning icy storms. Now you're infinitely more powerful and this was your game plan? Hucking fucking rocks at the speed of sloth? You could argue the simplistic attack pattern could be saved with a gimmick, and it actually has one. And his name is Gilbert Godfrey. Jafar himself is basically invincible, and to deal damage, you have to hit his lamp, which is carried around by Iago. Small points for being consistent with the movie's lore in that genies are basically unkillable unless you do something to their lamp, but it doesn't amount to much in practice. Iago flies very slow and always just gingerly hovers above the arena, meaning he's almost always within range of your air combos. Not only that, but enough damage will even briefly knock him out, leaving the lamp completely vulnerable. I mock him, but Iago is honestly the MVP of the fight. Sora can cut through skyscrapers and beat up giant hellhounds, and somehow this puny parrot takes a Keyblade beating with way more dignity than he realistically should. Jafar, I don't mean to be a bother, but could you do something fast about this kid and his team of intellectual properties? I'm literally carrying this fight right now. Patience, Iago. The boulders were merely a warm-up. Now I'm fully prepared to wipe this street rat off the... Maleficent was right to call you beyond help. Moving on from that last segment, I think I've got the perfect chance to talk about bosses from licensed games. If the Disney villains were anything to go by, a boss that happens to be a character you already have an attachment to from a show or movie can be pretty powerful and executed well. It's one thing to root against some antagonist while watching something, but actually playing it and beating them yourself is something entirely different. I think the word I'm looking for is catharsis. But of course, it has to be done well, and in case you didn't know this, most licensed games are usually struggling to do anything well. A bad boss in a bad licensed game is disappointing, but expected. However, a bad boss from an actually good licensed game is bound to be a lot more of a letdown. Oh, Anyone familiar with my channel could have seen this one coming. Dennis from the SpongeBob movie game has bothered me ever since I played it as a kid, and all this time later, I still kinda hate this. For anyone who doesn't know, Dennis is this stoic, no-nonsense bounty hunter sent by Plankton to murder SpongeBob and Patrick to prevent him from foiling his plan. In the movie, he's great, and a boss fight with him should have been a slam dunk, but all that intimidation he had in the movie has been entirely sapped away here. I know. Some people are looking at this and the game it comes from and wondering if I should be holding this to any sort of high standards, but this was Heavy Iron Studios who made this and Battle for Bikini Bottom. Not only good games, but games with pretty solid bosses. Some original, some based off existing characters. They nailed it with King Jellyfish, the Flying Dutchman, and even a mind-controlled King Neptune, but they choked so hard with Plankton's paid hitman. And lucky me, since there's not just one, but two fights with him and both have the exact same problems. All he does is send projectiles your way from afar and never bothers closing in the distance despite his clear strength and size advantage. You can deflect everything he sends back at you to quickly cut his health down. He never changes his strategy up with every third of health lost, unlike the other bosses in this game, opting to just summon extra mooks to harass you, which are actually more likely to kill you than the supposed main threat. And both fights take less than a minute. He's a joke. A bad punchline. And it annoys me because I know the devs can do so much better than this. These games do so much creative and fun stuff with the SpongeBob world and characters, but this didn't even feel like it was trying. Never have I felt so bad for someone hired to kill me. A long time ago, in the distant kingdom of Hyrule, a brave youth has set out on a quest to destroy an evil wizard set on freeing an ancient evil capable of bringing despair and ruin to the peaceful lands. Our hero needed the blade of evil's bane to prevent this calamity, and for that he would tirelessly travel to claim the 3 pendants of virtue from perilous dungeons and the monsters within guarding them. From the east, the pendant of courage from 6 knights of stone. From the west, the pendant of power from burrowing sand centipedes. And from the north, atop the almighty Tower of Hera, was the Pendant of Wisdom, protected by a living pinball bumper. You know what? Maybe Ganon taking over isn't so bad after all. Yeah, I know this isn't exactly a lava hot take within the Zelda fanbase, but Moldorm is genuinely one of the worst bosses in this series, if not the worst. A feat I'm almost impressed by considering how long the series has gone on for and how many bosses have come from it in that time, but then I remember it's Moldorm, and that it doesn't deserve anything. But why is this silly looking bug guy so awful? Well, imagine you had to fight a train. The only way to damage it is to hit its caboose, while the rest of the train is covered in inflatable tubes that bounce you incredibly far away. This train is also moving around very quickly and very wildly, with no identifiable pattern to speak of. And you're high up on a platform as this happens, where every time you get knocked off by the train, you have to slowly climb up and try again, where at that point, the train is fully repaired. Does that sound at all like a fun challenge to you? No? Well, that's basically the Moldorm fight. This fucker won't sit still, and a seemingly easy fight where it only takes 6 sword swings to the tail to kill it becomes this horrible ordeal where you'll climb up, get a couple hits in, but then you'll get knocked off the incredibly small boss arena. Either because Moldorm successfully bumped into you, or maybe because you accidentally hit its armored body instead of the tail, which is extremely easy to do because of how fast and unpredictable he moves around. And every time you fall, you land on the next floor down, walk back up the stairs, and jog halfway around the room just to try again. That doesn't sound like much, and hell, it might even be kind of funny in your first couple attempts. But then you realize that the damage you're doing to the boss isn't carrying over between attempts, and then it stops being funny. Then you start to notice the time it takes just to make another attempt, and it gets annoying. Then it dawns on you that the pots you've been breaking on the lower floor to restore your health aren't respawning, and it gets frustrating. Then the game goes straight into asshole territory, because once you get 5 hits on the bastard, Moldorm gets crazy fast and even harder to predict, which makes it even easier for him to send you off the edge and right back to square one. I'd normally be a little hesitant to throw an old game like Link to the Past under the bus like this, but this would only be the case if Moldorm felt like a mistake brought on by the devs not knowing any better. But that's not what this feels like. Moldorm feels 100% intentional in how it was designed to deck the player over, and I just can't with that. Who on Nintendo's development team was so pissed off one day that they felt the need to create this abomination? I've got a certain train I want to introduce them to. Okay, so I'm not going to do any fancy build-up for this one. My least favorite boss is Father Matthias from Tomb Raider 2013. People don't really talk about this game, which is kind of understandable since there was another third-person, story-focused shooter survival game that was getting all the attention back in 2013. I think it was called The Final of Wii. But I played the game a few months ago, and it was great. Genuinely. It's an incredibly solid Uncharted meets old school Tomb Raider with a pretty enticing story about Laura's origins as a fresh-faced archaeology student, and how a horrible set of circumstances transforms her into the badass gunslinging adventurer lady she's famously known as. But what are these circumstances I bring up? Well, long story short, Laura and her expedition crew are stranded on an island that seems to prevent anyone from leaving. That wouldn't be so bad on its own, but it doesn't take long for Laura to encounter the Solari, basically a murderous cult that worship a sun goddess who's the reason the island is cursed. And at the head of the table is Father Matthias, a man who definitely lost all his marbles a long time ago and is as effective as he is brutal. He indoctrinates people by throwing them in a poisonous murder cave to starve and mentally crack till they're willing to join his cause. That alone could prove my point. He's got Sam, Laura's colleague and best friend slash girlfriend? I could believe it either way. And he's gonna perform a ritual to let that sun goddess possess Sam's body so that he can finally leave. The finale is so cool and builds up so wonderfully, with Laura scaling and stealthing her way up this giant tower, killing countless Solari and undead samurai during a storm of biblical proportions, and even getting a proper boss fight against the Oni leader. Alright, Matthias, time for the ultimate showdown, and... Oh. Is this what we're doing? The final boss against the man both directly and indirectly responsible for not only most of the pain Laura has experienced on this journey, but also the deaths of the other crew members that he and his men killed along the way. And it's done entirely through QuickTime events. I don't think I need to explain why making your final boss a glorified cutscene that you barely get to interact with is a bad thing, but in case you're new to video games, that's a horrible, monumental fuck-up. It's kinda like the problem of Krauser, but at least there you got to fight him for real shortly after the QTE fest. Oh, and also it wasn't the final fucking boss in a game that's meant to be satisfying to finish. You could argue that at this point in the game there's no way you can make a realistically fair fight between the scrawny Matthias and the one-woman army who successfully mowed down both his men and the army that was also casually carving their way through his men, but this is Tomb Raider. It's all supernatural. They could have done pretty much anything to spice this up and people probably would have been on board for it. And even if they couldn't, I would have preferred fighting him in gameplay rather than a cutscene. It just feels so hollow. We get a decent enough boss against the Big Oni, someone neither the player nor Laura has any real personal beef with. Hell, he's probably inadvertently helped us more than he's hindered us. But Matthias, the actual antagonist that put us through so much shit, gets killed with a literal handful of button presses. Imagine if in Ocarina of Time, this random Iron Knuckle got the boss treatment and Ganondorf got shafted and killed with cutscenes. That would be such a deflating experience, and that's what Matthias is. Deflating. If I wanted cutscenes to do my job, I'd just go watch a movie. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please consider liking the video and subscribing. This is just another thing I felt like making, and who knows, maybe if it does well, I'll go back in for another top 10 something or other. We'll see. And hey, regardless of what you thought of this, comment down below with some of your least favorite boss fights. I'm curious what others have to say on the subject. But anyway, this has been Baileyography, and I wish you all my very best.